blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every impurity and save our souls, O good one. Amen. Okay. Ah, there's Dimitri. Good to see you.
Oh, hello.
You had lots of prayers going your direction.
What was that?
They said they're praying for you.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much, James. I'm saved by the prayers. That's all I can say.
Oh, thank God. It's good to see you up and around and well.
I'm gaining strength. I'm not 100% there.
It takes time.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Hopefully everything will come fine. That's exactly right. I have to go to some classes and everything.
Some physical therapy.
Physical therapy. That's heart therapy. You know.
Yeah.
That's the whole thing. Make the story short. I'm not going to take too much of your time. It's the very first portion of the surgery. They still, after the surgery was finished, they looked at it and they saw that it's still leaking. The blood was leaking from the blood.
Mm-hmm.
And there is two doctors, not one doctor, two doctors. And they decided not to replace the previous valve, but they added another valve. Uh-huh. So I have two valves. And the second valve, thanks God, it did the job.
Uh-huh.
And that's where I am right now. I'm with two valves.
Okay, good.
Two for the price of one.
Yeah. It's not a price of one. I mean, it's 6 hours of surgery. It's not.
You're now a bivalve.
That's right.
We're a bivalve, Dimitri.
Yeah. I'm not going to take anybody's time. As I said, I'm gaining strength. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. You can go.
Okay. So this is where we stopped the last time. And so does anybody have any questions from the last time? Okay, well, why don't we start? And who would like to read?
You'd probably look at the page.
There.
Okay, thank you, dear.
Hello. Okay.
I could read if I'm coming through
okay.
Clearly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, 3:3.
Okay. In church-state relations, the difference in their nature should be taken into account. The church has been founded by God himself, our Lord Jesus Christ, while the God-instituted nature of state power is revealed in historical process only indirectly. The goal of the church is the eternal salvation of people, while the goal of the state is their well-being on earth. My kingdom is not of this world, says the Savior. This world is only partially obedient to God, but for the most part it seeks to become autonomous from its own Creator and Lord. To the extent the world disobeys God, it obeys the father of lies, and lieth in wickedness. But the church, as the body of Christ and the pillar and ground of truth, in her mysterious essence can have no evil in herself, nor any shadow of darkness. Since state is part of this world, it has no part in the kingdom of God, for where there is Christ, all in all, there is no room for coercion, nor is there opposition between the human and the divine. Hence, there is no state.
Mm-hmm.
Contemporary world, state is normally secular and not bound by any religious commitment. Its cooperation with the church is limited to several areas and based on mutual non-interference in each other's affairs. However, the state is aware as a rule that earthly well-being is unthinkable without respect for certain moral norms. The norms which are also essential for the eternal salvation of man. Therefore, the tasks and work of the church and the state may coincide not only in seeking purely earthly welfare, but also in the fulfillment of the salvific mission of the church. The principle of the secular state cannot be understood as implying that religion should be radically forced out of all of the spheres of the people's life, that religious association should be debarred from decision-making on socially significant problems and deprived of the right to evaluate the actions of the authorities. This principle presupposes only a certain division of domains between church and state and their non-interference into each other's affairs. The church should not assume the prerogatives of the state, such as resistance to sin by force, use of temporal authoritative powers, and assumption of the governmental functions which presuppose coercion or restriction. At the same time, the church may request or urge the government to exercise power in particular cases, yet the decision rests with the state. The state should not interfere in the life of the church or her government doctrine, liturgical life, counseling, etc., or the work of canonical church institutions in general, except for those aspects where the church is supposed to operate as a legal identity obliged to enter into certain relations with the state, its legislation, and governmental agencies. The church expects that the state will respect her canonical norms and other internal statutes.
So this is a pretty interesting thing coming after years of Soviet interference and control and domination, and ultimately very hostile control of the church. You have here this a kind of a basic presupposition that the church and state are independent entities, but yet they interrelate and one can support the other. Each can support the other. And I think this is pretty much, to some extent, the way our society also used to function. Church and state were completely separate on one hand, and yet the church the church's activity had been facilitated by the state. For example, the nonprofit status of church properties and nonprofit status of church entities and corporations, and in many places a cooperation between them, and especially in regards to the whole moral life of society. This, of course, has gone by the wayside as the United States has become more Soviet, and the Soviet and Russia has desovietized. Of course, under communism, the church and the state are at enmity with one another, with the goal of the church, or the goal of the state, to destroy the church and completely disenfranchise it. Thank God that is long past. But I think it's also interesting that it emphasizes that the church and the state do not interfere in each other's affairs. They each have their own sphere of influence. The state protects the church, but the church also complements the state in providing the moral and a lot of social activities and social work within the life of the nation. Does anybody else have any comments so far? No comments? Okay. So shall we continue?
Vladika, it talks about, what does it mean when it says, it sort of emphasizes the church should not use force. Can you say a little bit more about that? I'm trying to find where it says that. The church should not assume the prerogatives of the state, such as resistance to sin by force, use of temporal authoritative powers, and the assumption of the government functions, which presuppose coercion or restriction.
Well, in other words, the church doesn't have a militia.
Okay.
It doesn't have a police force. It doesn't. What's that?
There's a little bit.
I'm just wondering if I'm able to be seen. Don't try to. No, don't.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, very good.
Okay. So,
basically, I think there's this delineation in terms of power. The church does have power, but it's a persuasive power,
right.
That's divine, whereas the temporal state, it has a power, but it's like a post-lapsarian fallen kind of coercive power. And when people aren't within the context of of life in the church, then you have the fallenness of the world, and then a different kind of dynamic is understood. Coercive power, but that's not the power that the church has, which is divine. God doesn't force coercively, but persuades, as it were.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Actually, I had a question about that. So is this just particularly to Russia, or is this to the Orthodox world as a whole?
This is particular to Russia.
This is okay, because I was wondering, isn't, like, for example, like the Church of Cyprus, isn't the church much more involved governmentally?
Yeah, it is. In fact, there was a time when the Archbishop of Cyprus was also the head of state. That's certainly not the case anymore, but there's a very great cooperation, and there's great honor given to the head of the church in Cyprus. So,
I mean, is this something? So, I mean, how does the rest of the? I don't know if this is too broad of a question, but how does the rest of the Orthodox world view this, as far as like Orthodox nations?
Well, for most of them, they're secular. For most of them, they're secular societies with majority Orthodox churches. Greece, Russia, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania. The Orthodox Church has a particular, unique place in those states, and there's and has a very strong role in those states. However, it's not part of the government. Now, the Church of Greece is a state church, which means that the government provides the salaries. And I don't know about these other, some of the other churches in the Balkans. In Georgia, there's a very close relation between the church and the state. And actually, in many of the Orthodox countries, the patriarch is seen on almost an equal footing with the president. So it's a very high level of respect that's given. So
I guess the question is, like, do they do all the bishops kind of support this idea of the state staying in their realm of influence and the church staying in theirs? Like this kind of, because I guess I always thought this was kind of something unique to American culture, like this concept of separating church and state. Or am I just kind of off on a tangent?
Well, in the Orthodox East, there's always been a distinction between church and state. Even in the Roman Empire, there was always a distinction, you know, and each had their particular role, and they had this very specific kind of interrelationship. And you know, in some places closer, in other places further apart. In Russia, you still have, you know, Russia's, although the great majority of people in Russia are baptized Orthodox, those that are actively Orthodox, it's less than 10%. You know, in Greece, it's about 25%. In Cyprus, it's about 90%. It's a big difference.
Oh, wow.
So you've got very different situations going on all over the Orthodox world, and with, you know, with all sorts of different kinds of things going on. So,
is Greece the only like state-sponsored church, like the Church of Greece, the only state-sponsored one?
I think the Church of Greece is the only state-sponsored church in Greece. But for example, ROCOR is state-supported in Germany.
Yeah, countries, you have the option to contribute a portion of your taxes to one of the established churches, and in some countries like Finland, Sweden, and Germany, the Orthodox Church is one of the recognized established institutions. So in that sense.
Yeah.
They receive some sort of subsidy, I guess, but are like, I guess my question would be, do any of the other predominantly Orthodox nations specifically pay the Orthodox clergy besides?
I don't know.
I guess I'll have to hunt that down.
Yeah, I don't know.
In Russia, I don't believe they are.
No, the church and the state are totally separate so far as finances goes. The way the church is supported there is the same way that it's supported over here. It's private donations.
Because I've been watching some videos in Russian, and there was like a few priests that were actually advocating, because I guess in Russia there's moratorium, like clergy are not allowed to run for any sort of public office or actually get involved directly in state affairs.
Right.
And I guess like here, yeah. And there were, I guess there were a few priests that were advocating the contrary, like actually lifting that sort of moratorium.
Well, it's one of the ancient canons. So my guess is that's not going to happen.
I don't know. So that is something that's like in the canon, like keeping that separate.
Right. And if it was in the canons, that means that was the case in the Roman Empire.
Okay.
So it goes way back, and you know, and there was symphony between the church and the state, but the church was distinct from the state. Okay, let's continue, and we're at 3:4.
Various models of relationship between the Orthodox Church and the state have developed in the course of history. The Orthodox tradition has developed an explicit ideal of church-state relations. Since church-state relations are two-way traffic, the above-mentioned ideal could emerge in history only in a state that recognizes the Orthodox Church as the greatest people's shrine. In other words, only in an Orthodox state. Attempts to work out this form were undertaken in the In Byzantium, where the principles of church-state relations were expressed in canons and the law of the empire and were reflected in patristic writings. In their totality, these principles were described as symphony between church and state. It is essentially cooperation, mutual support, and mutual responsibility without one side intruding into the exclusive domain of the other. The bishop obeys the government as a subject, not his episcopal power comes from a government official. Similarly, a government official obeys his bishop as a member of the church, who seeks salvation in it, not because his power comes from the power of the bishop. The state in such symphonic relationships with the church seeks her spiritual support, prayer for itself, and blessing upon its works to achieve the goal of its citizens' welfare, while the church enjoys support from the state in creating conditions favorable for preaching and for spiritual care of her children, who are at the same time citizens of the state. St. Justinian, in his sixth novella, formulates the principle lying in the basis of church-state symphony. The greatest blessings granted to human beings by God's ultimate grace are priesthood and kingdom, the former, priesthood, church authority, taking care of divine affairs, while the latter, kingdom, government, guiding and taking care of human affairs, and both come from the same source, embellishing human life. Therefore nothing lies so heavy on the hearts of kings as the honor of priests, who on their part serve them, praying continuously for them to God. And if the priesthood is well ordered in everything and is pleasing to God, then there will be full harmony between them in everything that serves the good and benefit of the human race. Therefore, we exert the greatest possible effort to guard the dogmas of the church and the honor of the priesthood, hoping to receive through it great blessings from God and to hold fast to the ones which we have. Guided by this norm, Emperor Justinian in his novellas recognized the canons as having the power of state laws. The classical Byzantine formula of relationships between state and church power is contained in the Epanagoge, later 9th century. The temporal power and the priesthood relate to each other as body and soul. They are necessary for state order, just as body and soul are necessary in a living man. It is their linkage and harmony that the well-being of the state lies. This symphony, however, did not exist in Byzantium in an absolutely pure form. In practice, it was often violated and distorted. The church was repeatedly subjected to Caesarian papist claims from the state authorities, which were essentially the demands that the head of the state, the emperor, should have the decisive say in ordering church affairs. Along with the sinful human love of power, these claims had also a historical reason. The Christian emperors of Byzantium were direct successors to the Roman pagan rulers, who among their numerous titles had that of Pontificus Maximus, chief priest. The Caesarian papist tendency manifested itself most bluntly and dangerously for the church in the policy of heretical emperors, especially in the iconoclast era. Unlike Byzantine Basileus, Russian Tsars had a different legacy. For this and other historical reasons, relationship between the church and state authorities was more harmonious in Russian antiquity. However, there were also deviations from the canonical norms under Ivan the Terrible and in the confrontation between Tsar Alexis Mikhailovich and Patriarch Nikon. As far as the synodal period is concerned, the evident distortion of the symphonic norm for 2 centuries in church history is associated with the distinct impact that the Protestant doctrine of territory in established church, see below, made on the Russian perception of law and order and political life. An attempt to assert the ideal of symphony in the new situation when the empire collapsed and was made by the local council of 1917 to 1918. In the declaration that preceded the action on church-state relations, the demand to separate church and state was likened to the wish that the sun should not shine and fire should not warm up. The church, by the internal law of her being, cannot renounce her calling to enlighten, to transform the whole of human life, to imbue it with her rays. In the resolution of the Council on the legal status of the Orthodox Church of Russia, the state is called upon to accept, in particular, these provisions. The Russian Orthodox Church, being part of the one universal Church of Christ, shall have the preeminent public and legal status among other confessions in the Russian state. which befits her as the greatest shrine for the overwhelming majority of the population and a great historical force that built the Russian state. As soon as they are made public, decrees and statutes issued by the Orthodox Church for herself and the order established by herself, as well as deeds of the church, government, and court, shall be recognized by the state as legally valid and important unless they violate state laws. State laws concerning the Orthodox Church shall be issued only with the consent of the church authorities. Subsequent local councils were held in situations when territory made it impossible to return to the when history made it impossible to return to the pre-revolutionary principles of church-state relations. Nevertheless, the church asserted her traditional role in the life of society and expressed readiness to work in the social field. Thus, the 1990 local council stated, throughout her millennium-long history, the Russian Orthodox Church educated the faithful in the spirit of patriotism and love of peace. Patriotism is manifested in the concern for the historical heritage of the fatherland, an active civil position by sharing the joys and hardships of her people, in zealous and conscientious work and in concern for the moral state of society and for the preservation of nature, from the message of the council. In the European medieval West, the doctrine of two swords was formed not without influence by the work of St. Augustine called On the City of God. According to it, both church and state power, the former directly and the latter indirectly, go back to the Bishop of Rome. It's debatable. Popes were absolute monarchs ruling over the papal states as part of Italy, the remnant of which is what is the Vatican today. Many bishops, especially in feudally divided Germany, were princes with state-like jurisdiction over their territories, with their own governments and armies, of which they were leaders. The Reformation left no ground for the popes and Catholic bishops to preserve their power in the territories of countries which became Protestant. In the 17th through 19th centuries, the legal conditions in Catholic countries also changed so much that the Catholic Church was in fact removed from government. Along with the Vatican, however, the doctrine of two swords helped to retain the practice of concluding agreements in the form of concordats between the Roman Curia and states in which there were Catholic communities. Due to this, the legal status of these communities was determined in many countries not only by internal laws, but also by the law regulating international relations to which the Vatican State was subject. In the countries where the Reformation triumphed and later in some Catholic countries, the territorial principle was established in church-state relations, giving to state full sovereignty over a territory and the religious commitments found in it. The system of relations was expressed in the phrase, "Cuius est regio, illus est religio." The religion of the sovereign is the religion of the country. If realized consistently, this system implies that those whose faith is different from that of the bearers of the highest state power should be banished from the state, a practice realized more than once. In real life, however, this principle gained a foothold in a softer form, described as the established church. It gives to the majority religious community to which the sovereign belongs, in which he officially heads, the privileges of the state church. A combination of this system of church-state relations with remnants of the traditional symphony inherited from Byzantium determined the peculiarity of the legal status of the Orthodox Church in the synodal period in Russia. In the United States of America, where there have been a multi-confessional state from the outset, the principle of radical separation of church and state has been established, whereby our system is neutral to all confessions. However, absolute neutrality is hardly feasible at all. Every state has to reckon with the real religious composition of its population. No Christian denomination taken separately makes up the majority of the United States, yet the decisive majority of U.S. people are precisely Christians. This reality is reflected in particular in the fact that the president takes the oath of office on the Bible, Sundays or official days off, etc. The principle of church-state separation, however, also has another genealogy. In the European continent, it has resulted from the anti-clerical or outright anti-church struggle well known, in particular, from the history of the French Revolution. In these cases, the church is separated from the state not because of the multi-confessionalism of the population, but because the state identifies itself with a particular anti-Christian or altogether anti-religious ideology. making it pointless to speak about its neutrality toward religion and even its purely secular nature. For the church, it normally means restrictions, limited rights, discrimination, or outright persecution. The history of the 20th century has given many examples of this attitude of the state toward religion and church in various countries of the world. There is also a form of church-state relations intermediate between the established church and the radical separation of church and state, whereby the church has the status of a private corporation. It is the status of the church as a legal public corporation. In this case, the church can have some privileges and obligations delegated to her by the state without being the established church in the proper sense of this word. Today, a number of countries, such as Great Britain, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Greece, still have established churches. Other states, which increasingly grow in number, the United States, France, build their relations with religious communities on the basis of full separation. In Germany, the Catholic, Evangelical, and some other churches have the legal status of legal public corporations, while other religious communities are fully separated from state and regarded as private corporations. In practice, however, the real status of religious communities in most of these countries depend little on whether they are separated or not from the state. In some countries where churches have retained their public status, it has been reduced to collecting taxes for the upkeep by the public fiscal administration and recognizing church baptism and marriage records as valid legally as civil status certificates registered by public administrative bodies. Today, the Orthodox Church performs her service of God and people in various countries. In some of them, she represents the nationwide confession, Greece, Romania, Bulgaria, while in others, which are multinational, the religion of the ethnic majority, Russia, and still other countries, those who belong to the Orthodox Church comprise a religious minority surrounded by either heterodox Christians, Finland, Poland, the United States, or people of other religions, Japan, Syria, Turkey. In some small countries, the Orthodox Church has the status of the state religion, Cyprus, Greece, Finland, while in other countries it is separated from the state. There are also differences in the concrete legal and political contexts in which the local Orthodox churches live. They all, however, build both their internal order and relations with the government on the commandments of Christ, teaching of the apostles, holy canons, and 2,000-year-long historical experience, and in many situations find an opportunity to pursue their God-commanded goals, thus revealing their otherworldly, scroll down to nature, their heavenly divine origin.
Okay, so comments, questions? Basically, there's a number of different models.
This is Frank. My understanding in some Western European countries, Sweden, Germany, the church activities, and particularly sermons and catechetical activities, are subject to state censorship, and that they are not allowed to take certain positions on social issues that the state has passed laws about. And I know in Sweden for some time they've monitored sermons, have people in churches monitoring them so there's no political content, but I think it's, you know, they may be forced to accept other forms of doctrine that's not Christian as well in practice, or not advocate for what they believe in, particularly on marriage, but other things also.
Yeah, it's my understanding that in some of those countries, the Church of Denmark, for example, it's legally required that they perform same-sex marriage ceremonies because it's a publicly funded institution, and so that's the law of the state, and the church has to oblige. So if you want to have the tax funding and maintain your salary and your congregation, you have to comply essentially.
Mm-hmm. Well, many of us are afraid that that's exactly what's going to happen here, and that we also will be made to comply. You know, and I think we're sadly seeing the beginnings of it with this whole all this stuff under COVID, all the regulations. So.
And I think some countries too, in this vein of have outlawed homeschooling. I think Germany comes to mind and Sweden, but I'm not sure of the others. So, and so they want to make sure that certain ideas are not transmitted to children. Or they want to make sure certain ideas are actually, you know, they want the state to have more influence over the education of children.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in the moral realm. So some Catholic schools may have to close actually in some jurisdictions, because if they stay open, they'll have to promote abortion, same-sex marriage, accept sex education in certain schools, graphically represented with images, I think. So I think that does foreshadow what's coming here.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to resist it. So.
I think it maybe is worth to make one point of clarification about Augustine and City of God. I've read the text. You know, where makes the argument that the Bishop of Rome has, is the source of both temporal and spiritual authority. I mean, this is something that develops centuries later in the Western context. But kind of the basic idea in the book, The City of God, is that there are two cities: the heavenly city, which is the church, the people of God, and the earthly city, which is, essentially the fallen worlds, the Tower of Babel, and trying to kind of reestablish that throughout the ages. And the heavenly city, the church, exists in pilgrimage within the earthly city, but is not a part of it. And this is something that encapsulates the view of the church, both east and west, and I think has a lot of relevant ideas for us today. Orthodox Christians would really benefit from reading City of God, I think. But yeah, he wasn't like supporting some kind of far-flung like papal doctrine or anything.
Okay, does anyone else have anything? Okay, shall we go on to 3.5?
One extra thing, I guess I would interested to think about how this would apply, like in like Muslim countries, for example, or in contexts in which it's not so much a secular humanism that is trying to curtail the operation of the church, but another religious majority. And we have plenty of experience with that in the life of the church. But I guess like in the modern kind of context of like the globalized world and the idea of the nation states, like what we see, in Turkey, how they kind of just have obliterated the situation of the Greeks there. I don't know, maybe that's another conversation, but it'd be interesting to reflect on.
Well, yeah. I think you're dealing with a whole different, it's certainly a different, entirely different question when you're dealing with the the church as a persecuted religious minority, in which it does not have the right to operate freely, which it doesn't in Islamic societies. So, whereas in Russian society and American society, most European societies, the church can operate more or less freely, though we're seeing more and more state coercion. And and this is, which I believe is extremely problematic. AJ, you want to keep reading?
Sure. Given their different natures, church and state use different means for attaining their goals. The state relies basically on material power, including coercion, and on respective secular ideological systems, whereas the church has at her disposal religious and moral means to give spiritual guidance to the flock and to attract new children. The church infallibly preaches the truth of Christ and teaches moral commandments which came from God himself. Therefore, she has no power to change anything in her teaching, nor has she the power to fall silent and to stop preaching the truth, whatever other teachings may be prescribed or propagated by state bodies. In this respect, the church is absolutely free from the state. For the sake of the unhindered and internally free preaching of the truth, the church suffered persecution by the enemies of Christ not just once in history, but the persecuted church is also called to endure the persecution with patience, without refusing to be loyal to the state persecuting her. Legal sovereignty in the territory of a state belongs to its authorities. Therefore, it is they who determine the legal status of a local church on her part, either giving her an opportunity for the unhampered fulfillment of the church's mission or restricting this opportunity. Thus, state power makes judgment on itself and eventually foretells its fate. The church remains loyal to that state, but God's commandment to fulfill the task of salvation in any situation and under any circumstances is above this loyalty. If the authority forces Orthodox believers to apostatize from Christ and his church and to commit sinful and spiritually harmful actions, the church should refuse to obey the state. The Christian, following the will of his conscience, can refuse to fulfill the commands of the state, forcing him into a grave sin. If the church and her holy authorities find it impossible to obey state laws and orders, after a due consideration of the problem, they may take the following action. Either enter into direct dialogue with authority on the problem, call upon the people to use the democratic mechanisms to change the legislation or review the authorities' decision, appeal to international bodies and the world public opinion, and appeal to her faithful for peaceful civil disobedience.
Well, undoubtedly, this is what we're facing. What we're facing in this culture. So as the state becomes more and more coercive, let's hope we don't have to take some of these actions.
And that peaceful civil disobedience is what is emphasized. I mean, you're not going to find anywhere in this document saying, exercise your Second Amendment rights to, do the will of the church. But not that that's not a question in some contexts, but, the idea is that the church's tools are spiritual. So her resistance in that sense is, spiritual.
Right, exactly.
Although there's the example recently in Texas of a Protestant church, I believe, that a gunman went in there and waited till the service was underway. It was a Protestant service, Christian, and started shooting people. And someone in the church who was a member had a weapon, and after that man had already killed people, he fired upon him. So I think in some places there are individual believers, though they're not Orthodox in this case, who have weapons, and in this case, acted, I think, defensively to prevent more people from being killed. That's problematic, but some people are armed to try to cope with violence. Other people are not armed at all, and just there's nothing they can do except try to flee.
Are weapons ever allowed in church, Politica?
What's that?
Are weapons ever allowed in church?
Well, depends on what state you're in. There are weapons in church. There certain law enforcement agents are duty bound, legally bound, to be armed at all times, including in church. So down at St. Herman's, we had to make a decision because the two subdeacons at one point, one was an FBI agent and the other was a DEA agent. And so we had to determine where to put the gun safe in the altar, in the sacristy. And we probably have half a dozen people. Virginia's an open carry state. So we probably have half a dozen people in the congregation who are armed and ready at any point. So
violation of canonical law or anything?
I don't know. But that's part of the reality, and that's part of the reality we have to deal with law enforcement people. So the church is not anti-weapon. The church is anti-violence. So, and if the weapons help keep the peace, then
I've seen in Russia, there's like photos of like Cossacks who would come in like with their sabers and whatnot.
Oh yeah.
That had gone into church. So I mean, this was commonplace at one point in time.
Yeah.
But I've seen hit or miss. I've seen in California. I don't know if I'm sure you know him, John Weber. He wanted to, I mean, he's a Marine Corps officer, and he wanted to have his saber on him during his wedding, and he was not allowed to. He was told he must remove his saber.
That's California.
Well, that was the cathedral. That wasn't actually California. That was the cathedral told him, you will not come into the cathedral with a saber, even though it's part of his uniform.
Uh-huh.
That was in San Francisco.
Yeah, that was at the cathedral in San Francisco.
Oh, well, it's still San Francisco.
Yeah.
So, interesting. Well, the Metropolitan hasn't said anything about it, so, and of course is informed of it. So
You're not going to carry a saber, are you?
Well, fortunately, my uniform does not include a saber or a cutlass.
Your uniform probably has a dictionary.
It probably should.
So, okay, shall we go with paragraph 6 or section 6? Anybody else want to read? Or we leave it to AJ?
Do you want me to have a read?
Yeah, I can keep going. You can go.
I'll give it a go. Section 6. The principle of freedom of conscience, which emerged as a legal notion in the 18th to 19th century, has become a fundamental principle of interpersonal relations only after World War I. It was confirmed by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and included in the Constitution of most states. The emergence of this principle testifies that in the contemporary world, religion is turning from a social into a private affair of a person. This process in itself indicates that the spiritual value system has disintegrated and that most people in society which affirms the freedom of conscience no longer aspire for salvation. If initially the state emerged as the instrument of asserting divine law in society, the freedom of conscience has ultimately turned state in an exclusively temporal institute with no religious commitments. The adoption of the freedom of conscience as legal principle points to the fact that society has lost the religious goals and values and become massively apostate and actually indifferent to the task of the church and to the overcoming of sin. However, this principle has proved to be one of the means of the church's existence in the non-religious world, enabling her to enjoy a legal status in a secular state and independence from those in society who believe differently or do not believe at all. The religio-ideological neutrality of the state does not contradict the Christian idea of the church's calling in society. The church, however, should point out to the state that it is inadmissible to propagate such convictions or actions which may result in total control over a person's life, convictions, and relations with other people, as well as erosion in personal, family, and public morality, insult of religious feelings, damage to the cultural and spiritual identity of the people, and threats to the sacred gift of life. In implementing her social, charitable, educational, and other socially significant projects, the Church may rely on the support and assistance of the state. She also has the right to expect that the state, in building its relations with religious bodies, will take into account the number of their followers and the place they occupy in forming the historical, cultural, and spiritual image of the people and their civic stand.
Well, this is interesting because this is exactly, of course, what the communist state did. It propagated actions which resulted in total control over a person's life, convictions, and relations with other people, and as well as erosion in personal, family, and public morality, insult of religious feelings, damage to cultural and spiritual identity, and so forth. So, this is the church reacting against the whole communist, socialist agenda, which is good. I think we need to take these to heart as well, as our state becomes more and more intrusive.
Also, I'd add in the United States, what is stated here, I think it's underway for some time now, and the concept that I've heard many secular people state is that they are for freedom of religion. However, what it also means to them, and they want the state to vigorously enforce this, it means freedom from religion, and that they shouldn't even have to, that no one should be allowed to, put a statue in a public place or in their front yard, or you can't refer or to have a Christmas party at work. It has to be a It has to have another name. There can't be, you know, any, let alone prayer or anything.
Yeah, ain't that the truth?
Christmas displays in public state. The ACLU, the American Criminal Liberties Union or Civil Liberties Union, puts lawsuits.
First time.
So they put all these lawsuits and you know, and judges give in and they don't want any public expression of religiosity at all. Or even in, remember the state where this judge, he was thrown out of office because he had up there the 10 Commandments publicly on a monument. Well, of course, that is a source of law. I mean, it's more remote, but historically, it's correct.
Yeah.
So.
Well, you know, I think one of the things that we need to respond with that is that atheism is a religion, and we need to, and the state needs to protect us from the atheists as well as just as much, and their intrusive demands limiting our freedom. They can be offended by us, and we can be offended by them. And one offense has no greater or lesser impact than the other. Although recently, of course, given the ideological orientation of so many of the judges, atheism has been given preference.
It was actually, I was reading an article recently. There was a genius in the army who had the idea of, we need to have an atheist chaplain. And so like the army was actually mulling over this idea of having an atheist chaplain. And they actually, eventually someone realized that this was ludicrous and they actually turned it down. Well, not exactly turned it down. They said, you do have an atheist chaplain. It's called go to the psychologist or whoever the secular mental health specialist is. There's your chaplain.
Well, and the other thing, we see coercion in this regard for, remember, the Sisters of the Poor, or I'm not getting the name correct. Why should religious nuns, be they Catholic or not, be forced to, against their conscience, to provide abortion and contraception, particularly when no one is compelled to join their organization or be subject to their disciplines, but that they want to make them submit. They want to force those women to give their money. I guess they would have to hire people that don't agree with their religious values, which we always saw as a violation, and make them pay for abortions. And that's not what the understanding of freedom of conscience is, to make people pay for child homicide, in my opinion. But
well, you have this new legislation in the state of Virginia is, essentially forces institutions to hire people where that violate their, they can have no religious test in hiring, and they need to hire people who violate their moral codes. It's very problematic for any church that has employees.
But that could even be taken to mean clergy, depending on how the judges want to legislate on that matter from the bench. So you'll be forced to hire clergy. So what they want is every even religious organization to be forced to deconstruct itself, right, to actively work to promote theology and ideology that's contrary to what it stands for, to destroy the organization.
Yeah.
Or turn it into a book club, or like the Unitarian Universalist, where you can believe in anything or nothing or everything except God, maybe.
The basic underlying idea at the root of a lot of this is the notion that religion, it's a fundamentally irrational motivator for public behavior and public policy motivation. So we can, a lot of it has to do with kind of the historical trauma of the Reformation and the wars of religion and all of that, the Enlightenment, but it's such a prevailing and deeply embedded idea in American culture, at different levels and to different degrees, that basically, well, religion, it's okay if it's private, but in terms of how it affects the course of society, people's behavior, and the kind of things that they're doing in the public sphere, then it's dangerous because it's irrational, and there has to be some kind of neutral secular means of adjudicating between different opinions. And that's why we have the legislature and the courts and everything. Well, just look at our political system to see what a disaster that idea is. But it's just kind of this prevailing myth in Western culture generally that you can't use religion as an excuse for something. That's just off the table. Even when the thing that you're arguing against is obviously egregious and ridiculous. So part of fighting back is sort of recognizing what these people are doing when they say, well, you can't just bring religion into the public debate. Well, hang on. What are you bringing into the public debate? Aren't you kind of bringing in beliefs and values that are kind of, what's wrong with me bringing in my experience and my understanding?
And also, I'd add to that, Alexander, the sociologists that studied change in society and religion back in the 1950s and 60s strongly believed, and the late Peter Berger wrote about this, they believed that as a society became more modern in a material sense, that it would also become more secular. And other than perhaps Western Europe, that theory has been falsified. And that caused a great deal of frustration among social scientists who said, we have to explain this. How can this be? Of course, a lot of them, inheritors of the ideology of the French Revolution, were upset, more radical people anyway. But sociologists were very frustrated, and many of them still can't grasp it. I mean, fortunately, Peter Berger is not Orthodox, it's Lutheran, but he was able to accept the reality and said, these sociologists are the ones that need to be explained rather than society. But I think that's part of it too, is that they thought religion should have disappeared by now. And it hasn't, and so it's making them insane. It's personally, psychologically, causing them very, stress.
Well, and that's, of course, also the Marxist thing, too. The Marxist argument.
Right.
On ideology.
And so they believe that their ideology is historical. It's tied to the laws of social forces, the law of history, and it's natural. They don't really realize they're against human nature because they're against God, but so it makes them very angry.
Well, there's a saying that money is the root of all evil, and many of the atheists seem to be well funded because they start legal proceedings against people like the cake baker because he refused to decorate his cake with two men who wanted to get married or something like that. So you wonder where they get all the funds from.
Yeah, that would be nice. Be nice to know.
Follow the money.
Yep. Yep.
It's just ultimately this ridiculous notion that you can somehow disentangle religion and somebody's familial, cultural, and social experience from who they are as an individual, and can all just kind of approach the public square without any prior commitments and just, just find the political solution, whether that's through some kind of Marxist idea of the laws of history, collapsing all of these artificial structures, or some kind of more liberal idea of like public reason. We just have natural rights and government's there to protect them, some kind of more libertarian perspective. But it's just such an absurd notion, the idea that we can somehow disentangle ourselves from who we are as human beings, and that our religiously motivated, quote unquote, views have no validity in the public arena. That's just such an artificial construction of modern Western society. I appreciate how this document and the Orthodox ethos as a whole, I think it really is uncomfortable with that and doesn't see things that way.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really important to have the church be the conscience of society, and I think that's something that we've fallen far short of. Of course, or being excluded from in our secular society, and instead, the secularism in its various forms has silenced the voice of most of the churches in this country, and in Western culture, and it's made the church irrelevant because it's subverted the church so that they've accepted all of the immorality of secularism, and so the church no longer has any moral authority, or Christianity has no moral authority because they've all compromised themselves with the world. This is where Orthodoxy has not fallen quite so far.
Well, many atheists are in favor of the freedom of religion as long as you agree with me.
Right.
If you, Alexander College, you have any idea how many of your professors would be atheists versus religious professors? Do you have any idea of the balance?
Well, thankfully right now I go to the Catholic University, so I would hope and pray that would be a small number. But my previous university was very secular, and for the most part, with a few good exceptions, it was pretty overwhelmingly, antagonistic or dismissive toward religion. Like some of the Christian groups on campus at the University of Tulsa sponsored a lady to come and speak who was a former lesbian and just kind of share her testimony. And several of the academic departments in the school launched a formal protest against that. Just the audacity of somebody coming and sharing their testimony to a privately organized event, like whole academic departments within the university. The different gay clubs on campus were all there protesting. So it is a very difficult environment and getting worse all the time, honestly.
Well, I think one of the things that we see with a lot of especially with the atheists and the militant secularists, is it really comes down to totalitarianism. It's you either agree with them or you're excluded. And that's certainly the left. You know, they accuse the the main line of American culture, of being fascist or something like that. But it's ridiculous, because instead we suffer from the from the excesses of liberalism. But there's no liberalism on the left. It's totalitarian and exclusive of those who differ from them. Wants to silence them.
When my daughters were checking out colleges where they might want to attend, we stopped off at Vassar, and the big display there was from I forgot how they worded it, but it was they were homosexuals or lesbians, I don't remember. I think it was a gay club, is what they referred it to. They got a prominent place, but I didn't see any tables saying of a religious group. And then Union College didn't have one single church on their campus. It seemed like they were completely keeping them religious denominations, all of them, away from their campus. But that you can live with as long as they don't persecute you. But you can't live with a policy where the gays were superior to the heterosexuals. But it really hit me rather like a club. And I told my daughters, you're not going to be applying to Vassar. They went to Colgate, and they have a chapel there. It's non-denominational, but different religious groups can conduct services there, and they agree on a schedule.
Well, okay. So you want to read number 7, and I think we'll end with that.
I can't read right now, Vadika.
Okay.
I'm going to wake someone up, so maybe someone else can read.
I'll read number 7. That's fine.
Okay.
Number 7. The form and methods of government is conditioned in many ways by the spiritual and moral condition of society. Aware of this, the church accepts the people's choice or does not resist it, at least. Under the judge's rule, the public system described in the book of Judges, power acted not through coercion, but authority, which was sanctioned by God. For this authority to be effective, the faith in society should be very strong. Under monarchy, power remains God-given, but for its exercise, it uses not so much spiritual authority as coercion. The shift from the judge's rule to monarchy indicated the weakening faith. The fact that caused the need to replace the king invisible by the king visible. Contemporary democracies, including those monarchic in form, do not seek the divine sanction of power. They represent the form of government in secular society that presupposes the right of every able-bodied citizen to express his will through elections. Any change in the form of government that more religiously rooted, introduced without spiritualizing society itself, will inevitably degenerate into falsehood and hypocrisy and make this form weak and valueless in the eyes of the people. However, one cannot altogether exclude the possibility of such a spiritual revival in society as to make natural a religiously higher form of government. But under slavery, one should follow St. Paul's advice. If thou mayest be free, use it rather. At the same time, the church should give more attention not to the system of the outer organization, but to the inner condition of her members' hearts. Therefore, the church does not believe it possible for her to become an interior of any change, an initiator of any change in the form of government. Along the same line, the 1994 Bishops' Council of the Russian Orthodox Church stressed the soundness of the attitude whereby the church does not give preference to any social system or any of the existing political doctrines.
Okay. You want to read those last two paragraphs on 8?
The state, including the secular state, is normally aware if it's calling to build the life of the people on the principles of good and just, taking care of both the material and spiritual welfare of society. Therefore, the church can cooperate with the state in affairs which benefit the church herself, as well as the individual and society. For the church, this cooperation should be part of her salvific mission, which embraces comprehensively the concern of man. The church is called to take part in building human life in all spheres where it is possible, and in doing so, to join efforts with representatives of the secular authority. Church-state cooperation should be realized on the following conditions: the church's participation in the work of the state is correspondent in her nature and calling. The state does dictate in the church's social work, and the church is not involved in the spheres of public activity where her work is impossible for canonical and other reasons.
Okay.
Shall I continue or finish that up?
I think we'll save this for next week. Let's see here. How do I do this? Anyway. So does anybody have any questions? Comments?
It's interesting that the people that are running stress religion, whether or not it's sincere is hard to say, but they pose themselves at least as being religious. So apparently they feel that more people will vote for them if they feel that they're religious. Have you noticed that? Has that struck you at all?
Yeah, certainly. You know, it's interesting that a certain the what do you call it? Can't think of it. Anyway, never mind. That's a particular political comment. So,
Vladika,
Yeah.
in sort of group psychology, do you think that we want them to be religious because we hope that that means they may act morally?
Well, that may be. You know, hope springs eternal. But I don't think it goes much beyond that.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
I think a lot of it has to do with the United States in particular being just our historical consciousness. Culturally, it's still, broadly speaking, kind of uncomfortable with outright atheism. And so when you're talking about a politician, having some kind of reference to religious identification, whether or not they care about that at all, or that motivates their policy decisions, and often it doesn't. It just kind of, it speaks to our cultural consciousness, vocabulary more. President Obama, he made frequent reference to, him describing himself as a Christian, but the consequences of that are clearly debatable. And, the examples are innumerable. Whereas like in Western Europe, you have, openly transgender, anti-religion people running for government all over the place. So that might kind of speak more to like the U.S. being sort of have some kind of consciousness toward that.
Well, I think Americans still have, most Americans still have some kind of religious values, whether they attend church or not, or what is it, 80% identify themselves as Christian, but only 40% attend church. There is a strong religious underpinning in our society, and I think we want our politicians to have those values, because they're the values shared by the bulk of the population. And they're the outliers. They're the the radical secularists, but in reality, I think that's actually a rather small part of the population. I don't think it's a majority of the population. In this, I think it's very interesting, because I think what they're referring to in number 7 here, this is the whole issue of monarchy, and for Russia, that's a real issue. For us, it's not, of course, unless it's the monarchy of the left, but that's a different issue. But the statement is that, I think, and it's the one in the bold caps, that unless society is spiritualized and comes to, in other words, unless the society comes to a certain level of spiritual maturity, any kind of movement towards a religiously based, that is probably a monarchical form of government, which is in its fundamental concept based in faith, it would end up being false and hypocritical. So that the church will not exercise any authority in trying to establish one form of government over the other. I think that was interesting. But I wonder if the Russian Orthodox Church would actively resist a return to a Bolshevik kind of state. My guess is they probably would. So,
Nick, are you saying specifically, like in Russia, that they would actually resist?
yeah, I think they would. Well, obviously they did in Russia in 1917 through, in the 30s, and how many died resisting.
Yeah.
Well, atheists are maybe people that don't like authority. There's a military term called contumacious people who are adverse to or perverse in resisting authority. So atheists probably, if they have that type of mentality where they can't tolerate anybody or any organization to tell them what to do, that may be a motivation, but it seems like a large percentage of our society seems to be resisting any kind of authority, and religion probably in their minds is representing supreme authority.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the problem for, at least, for American Christianity is just this strong degree of laxity and kind of just some kind of cultural unity. So both of the Democratic nominees for president have, said, oh, we're people of faith. We would never condemn this Supreme Court nominee because she's Catholic. That's absurd. But, if we think about like where American society is and how many people like, oh yeah, sure, I believe in God, I'm a Christian, I guess, but that's really the extent of it. And so their moral views are going to be shaped by the culture, by their political convictions, even if on some level, they're uncomfortable with the idea of like somebody in power outright saying like, oh, I'm anti-God, I'm an atheist, like I don't think an atheist could ever be elected president, at least not currently. But the huge cultural shift toward the left, I think a big problem has to do with just kind of the laxity and the watered down and uncaring nature that American religion has kind of come to.
Well, certainly American religion has been profoundly subverted. Mainline Protestant churches, even the Catholic Church. I just finished reading a very interesting book called Karl Marx and the Devil by a guy named Kengor. And it's really quite interesting. He goes on the basic thesis derived from the Marx's own writings and Marx's correspondence with his father and other people around him, that Marx was possessed. Richard Wurmbrand, who suffered in the Romanian Gulag, thought Marx was a Satanist. And then, so the book goes into Marx, talking about him, and who was a real lowlife, to say the least. And then it starts talking about the legacy of communism, and then goes into the permutations of Marxism in the more recent time, that cultural Marxism, and then what he calls sexual Marxism. It's quite fascinating, and it's amazing how much of the stuff that's going on now really is a manifestation of and a playing out of so much that came out of Marx's imagination.
Well, you mentioned Marx. When I went to Hiram College, which is a small college in Ohio, and I looked in the catalog in the library about the Communist Manifesto, and they had a copy of that. But they also had a copy of why Karl Marx didn't think that the communists manifesto could work. And that was written 2 years after he wrote the Communist Manifesto. When I went back to the college, my 50th anniversary, I was curious if those two references were in their catalog, even though it's now updated to a lot of it being digitized.
Yeah.
But it was not, that second book was not there anymore. So I have to try to get that in the Library of Congress, see if they have it there, but there are left-wingers working for the Library of Congress that might try to get rid of it.
Well, it's politically incorrect, probably.
I didn't hear that. What?
It's politically incorrect, undoubtedly.
Yeah, right.
So.
Well, I agree that the
Nietzschean nihilist.
Say that again?
And in many ways, Marx turns out to look more like a Nietzschean nihilist than somebody who actually is promoting a belief system that he really sincerely thinks is true.
Oh yeah.
Well,
I think that's actually a very accurate observation that he probably was a Nietzschean nihilist. You know.
You know, I agree with the statement that atheists have a problem with authority, because if you look at people, well, like Marx, but also like Lenin, Fidel Castro, he never worked for anyone. As soon as he got out from under the authority of university, and even there I know I talked to one of his professors in Miami. I mean, he was a bully, and you know, many things. But he never worked for anyone. He never worked for anyone. He tried to practice law. I don't think he maybe had 1 or 2 cases. His whole thing was he was always worked for himself. And no one worked with him. No one was a colleague. It was what he wanted. And he just, he couldn't stand authority. He didn't like his own father. He was like him a lot, a loudmouth. At least his father worked for a living. He never worked. So other people should give him money. And then when he got power, take the money by force, pointing guns at people. I mean, these people have a lot of problem with authority. And some of them do join the military, and you can pick them out. But yeah, I mean, it's true.
Well, Marx had a major problem with authority, and he also never worked.
But Stalin during World War II cut down on the persecution of the church and actually let the military have church services, because he felt that the soldiers needed that support from the atrocities and the horrors that they saw in front of them. Yeah. It was interesting that he recognized that the value of the church in that regard.
Well, so we've had our hour and a half. So shall we, does anybody have any other comments before we break up for tonight?
I guess, Vladika, I guess the last question I have, part we were reading, it said that the church does not favor any social system. And I was wondering, I mean, is there any circumstance where communism, is there any situation where communism and the church can actually peacefully coexist?
Not with communism, because one of the most fundamental doctrines of communism is the destruction of the church.
Yeah, I mean, there can't be any, I mean, that's the way I always believe is the communists, there can't be anyone higher than them. They don't want to compete for power or authority.
No.
They want to get into power. The communists want to rule.
Yeah, and they don't want to be challenged by anyone in any possible way.
Right.
So I mean, I guess like that part where we're reading that, like there are some limitations to that.
What do you mean? Well, yeah, I mean that the church doesn't favor, doesn't give preference to any social system. In other words, the church is able to exist in any social system. And in the context of any doctrine from its point of view, does it favor one system over others in Russia? Because that's what this is written in the context of. No. You know, it doesn't necessarily favor democracy over monarchy, over a republican form of government, or some kind of some kind of blending of all of those.
Based on, just to close, what the document as a whole says about the nature and purpose of the state and what it needs to do to fulfill its legitimate obligations. I think what's being said here is that it's not, so long as the state is acting legitimately and is not, persecuting the church and making fundamentally unjust decisions, the idea is that the church isn't supposed to kind of have like a political voice in determining whether, or what the condition of the markets are going to be, whether some kind of constitutional system versus some kind of more, like monarchical form of government should prevail, because it's not really the business of the church in that case. When we're talking about like direct persecution and calling out like when the state is committing atrocities, that's another question. Right. What's happening here.
Exactly.
I'm also wondering a little bit whether that statement that the church doesn't give preference to any social system is maybe the church stands back a little bit because we may have certain favorite systems, but people in general tend to, idealize or almost idolize sometimes different political systems.
Right.
And the church doesn't want to be, too close to people who are idolizing any system, because we should only worship God. We shouldn't worship any particular political system. Right. So the church probably just, I'm imagining that has something to do with what they're saying as well, that they are a moral voice and they have a domain, but they don't want to get so close to any political system that they would perhaps be participating in a form of idolatry to a political system. If do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think part of the context of this was a discussion of monarchy and as in other words, Orthodox monarchy, and I don't think the church is not pushing it. I think is one way this can be stated. One aspect of this. Anyway, so next Tuesday should be an interesting evening. We'll probably have another feed going as we do the Zoom. So let's hope and pray that the next week and the next months will be peaceful. Our country is in a very difficult state right now, and I think we need to pray for peace.
Yes, we do.
So, okay, shall we pray? It is truly me to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, without corruption that gave us birth to God the Word, Truth, Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever and into ages of ages. Amen.
Thank you, Vladika.
Thank you, Vladika. Good night.
All right. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.